the Medical AI Podcast.
Hello, I'm Dr. Felix Beacher, and this is the Medical AI Podcast, a 30-minute thrill ride of big ideas. We talk to a range of top guests, from industry innovators to scientists to philosophers. This is brought to you by Omdia and Informatech, where I'm the head of healthcare technology. The American futurist author John Nesbitt said, "We are drowning in information, but we are starved for knowledge." Now, if you type AI into Google, you'll find around 8 billion results. So getting the right information is fundamental to any kind of intellectual endeavor. So it is vital that search engines work well. The big question today is, can AI improve on how we search for clinical science literature? And joining me to discuss this is Eric Olson, the co-founder and CEO at Consensus. Consensus is a new AI-based search engine used predominantly for clinical science. Eric, a very warm welcome to the podcast.
Thank you so much for having me. Happy to be here.
So could you just introduce yourself and explain a little about Consensus?
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm Eric Olson. I'm the co-founder and CEO of Consensus. What Consensus is a new search engine that uses artificial intelligence, specifically language models, to find answers and claims made in peer-reviewed literature. So effectively, it allows you to come to the search engine and type in a natural language question, something like "Can ginger treat nausea?" And what the search engine will do, instead of just delivering you a list of links to papers or websites, it will actually go through peer-reviewed literature that has looked to answer that question and find the claims made within that paper that address that question. So you can kind of think of it as two ends of the spectrum. There's two ends of the spectrum where Consensus fits in the middle of it, where you have a search engine like Google that is scraping the entire internet. It might have some advanced functionality, but the source material is not, peer-reviewed evidence and has tons of advertisements. And then you can think of the other end of the spectrum as something like PubMed, which has a ton of medical literature and has great source material, but has been the same base search engine for the last decade, where you kind of have to keyword hack. It's only delivering you back a list of links, and there's no advanced analysis functionality. So we're kind of trying to bridge that gap and make searching through rigorous source material actually easy, intuitive, and a more advanced experience.
So let's imagine that I am looking for some peer-reviewed literature. How, in concrete terms, would my experience differ if I use, say, Google Scholar and Consensus?
Yeah.
What kind of things might I notice?
Totally. So it's going to be really similar to that comparison I just gave to PubMed. When you're using Google Scholar, you are beholden to just typing in your keywords. It doesn't have the ability to take in a natural language question and parse the meaning of what you're looking for and trying to find papers that answer that question. You basically just are exact keyword matching to the title of the paper. And then when you type that query in on Google Scholar, all you're getting back is a list of blue links. It's a pretty ugly user experience. It's a white page with blue links. And there's no advanced functionality where it's going into the paper and trying to find you specific information that you're likely looking for. So to tee that up, that the way that Consensus would address that, a question like this, if you were to come to Consensus, you could actually type in a full natural language question of what your research question is. And then, like I said before, instead of just delivering you the links, we actually will go through the paper and try to find the bits of the paper that have answered your question. On top of that, something that we're currently working on and looking to continue to add more and more is we're also using AI to judge the rigor quality of the paper, to basically say, is this a well-designed study? Does it come from a well-respected journal? Does it come from a well-respected author? and looking at using machine learning to analyze the paper and try to give the user an understanding of the likely quality of the paper, and adding nice, friendly indicators to the results that continue to make the user experience better. So, all in all, we hope to make it significantly more intuitive and easier, and do a lot of the analysis for you.
Okay, so why did you start up Consensus in the first place, Eric?
Yeah, I'm not a scientist by trade. I'm not a researcher by trade. I'm a data scientist by trade. But I love, I respect and adore the scientific process, and believe in the importance of getting good information. And it, really was a problem that I saw in my own life, that, even though I'm not using academic search engines, I'm using, the Googles of the world. That there's a huge problem on that side of, you're unable to access this incredible treasure trove of insights that is peer-reviewed research when you're typing things into Google. So you could type a question that there are people out there that have dedicated their entire lives to trying to empirically research. Yet when I type my question into Google, all I'm getting back to me is a blog written by some journalist on the topic that may or may not cite a study in it. And it's really
Right.
frustrating to know that there's all this amazing information out there, but for somebody like me who doesn't have an academic background or the attention span to actually comb through the literature, there's no tool that bridges that gap. There's no tool that can take the ease of use of Google and pair it with the rigor of the source material of Google Scholar. And then go ahead,
Mhm.
you go ahead.
So, how aware do you think clinical scientists are themselves of this kind of problem? Do you think it's something they've just got used to and is kind of invisible to them, or is it something that clinical scientists complain about?
Oh, it is absolutely something they complain about. So yeah, that's kind of the second part of it. We started with the hypothesis that if we addressed the use case for somebody like myself who's interested in engaging with this literature but doesn't have necessarily a robust background in it, that we would also address the problem that uh, more experienced consumers of the literature have, which is just, it's really hard to access. It's really hard to quickly get information. It's really hard to, in any advanced way, sift through the literature to find what you're looking for. There aren't really many tools to do that. And we hope that if we address that first problem, we could also start to tick off that second problem. It has happened to an extent that I don't think I could have ever imagined. And one of the places where it has taken off is in these clinical contexts. And I think one of the reasons why is specifically doctors. When they are searching for information, they act like consumers way more than a lot of people would like to believe that they do. Throwing quick, sometimes just typing their questions into Google. And if anybody in any context is trying to look up research backed information on Google, Consensus represents a much better avenue to go get that information, because we can give you all of that ease of use and intuitive nature that the plain Google search does. But now you can actually be engaging with that literature if you were to, for the same type of source material that if you were to pop up in Google Scholar or PubMed.
Okay, now we keep mentioning Google for obvious reasons.
Yeah.
Now, how aware are Google of these kind of problems with their product, and are they working on this kind of thing themselves?
uh, I don't know if they would themselves call it much of a problem, because uh, they're, the way that they've constructed their algorithms and the search engine set up, it kind of functions exactly like the way they set it up to function. They're an advertising business, so what they care about is engagement and clicks and eyeballs. Because that search results page is where they make their money. The longer you spend on that, the more eyeballs they have on that search results page, the more money they make. So it is not their goal to get you in and out of a search, and it is not their outright goal to just give you the best information. They're optimizing for engagement. It's why you get clickbaity blogs in your results, because those are what people, clickbaity is clickbaity for a reason. That's what people click on, and that allows them to continue to sell more ads.
Okay,
So it's not some conspiracy to misinform you. It's just a company following their incentives,
that's
which
right.
in their eyes is in their case is engagement, and that creates search engine that's a popularity algorithm, not a reputability algorithm. So
is that true even for Google Scholar, would you say?
no, because they do not show ads through Google Scholar, I do not believe. So I just think that it's been deprioritized by them because they
Yeah,
spend all their time focused on optimizing their regular search engine algorithms. So
right.
Google Scholar hasn't changed in a decade. So I don't think you get some of those same problems, but you don't get that same innovation. You don't get any of that advanced
Okay.
functionality.
So Google Scholar is just very basic and can be improved. Okay, so now you are yourself a business, and so I mean, do you suffer also from these kind of commercial biases at all? I mean, I guess you must to some degree, right?
Yeah, the way that we try to mitigate that is we're not showing any ads, and we are a subscription business. So right now, the product is actually completely free. We are trying to grow and improve the product and get a ton of user feedback. But later next month, we will be releasing our first premium features that will be behind paywalls, and we are going to make our money via subscriptions from individuals and from institutions. So as long as we are not showing you advertisements, all of our incentives are to only deliver you good information.
I
Uh,
see.
so, and we think that's incredibly important. We like to think that we're doing this for the right reasons, but incentives rule the world. And when you understand the incentives, you can understand the world. And
Yeah,
even though I know in my heart of hearts I want to do the right thing, if my incentives are set up in a way that I care most about engagement, inevitably sometime down the road our motives will shift toward just optimizing toward that if that's where the money is to be made. So uh, we do not want to put ourselves in that position. So
sure. Okay, but the free version of Consensus is still going to be usable for most people for most purposes. Is that right?
yeah, we really hope to keep what is currently built and is out there free forever. And then it's the additional functionality that we're building on top of it that we'd like to put
I
behind
see.
paywalls.
Very interesting. Okay, now we have to talk about the big buzz in the AI community right now, and you know what I'm talking about, ChatGPT.
Yeah,
Okay, so how does that compare to Consensus? Is it similar? Is it different? Is it more powerful? Is it less powerful? I mean, tell me about ChatGPT.
absolutely. Yeah, so it's similar and it's very different at the same time. So it's similar in the sense that the underlying technology is very similar. So we're both using large language models to execute our task. Large language models are uh, these giant machine learning models that have basically been shown the entire internet's worth of text that allow them to come with this latent embedded knowledge about human language, and then you can feed it your own custom data to teach it to do a specific task. And the real breakthrough is that it comes ready to do that task with a ton of pre-trained knowledge. That's when it's shown the entire internet. And you can think of it like it's almost like the way a human would learn how to do a task. Because if I were to teach you how to do something, you don't come to me as this blank slate. You come with knowledge of all the previous tasks you've learned to do, which make me teaching you how to do something go a lot faster. And that's the exact thing that happens with these language models. They come with this embedded knowledge, and then you can teach it to do a specific task. In ChatGPT's case, they have fine tuned it to sound like a human and have conversations to you like a human. In our case, we've taken another language model, it's slightly different, and then we have fine tuned it to go through literature like a scientist. So they're different in the sense that the task we're asking to do is different, and then also because of that, their task is what people call fully generative, where its goal is just to respond to what you are saying, and it comes up with text out of thin air. Whereas our task is extractive. So we basically have a model read a paper and then pull out important sentences, and we actually maintain the integrity of the sentence and we keep it word for word when we show you results. So it allows us to cite our sources. It allows us to understand where that phrase is coming from, tie it back to the paper and the authors, and we think that's really important for our use case. Whereas
Right.
ChatGPT is simply just a conversational chatbot. It's an amazing conversational chatbot, do not get me wrong, but it is a fully generative task where ours is extractive. So basically, it's similar in that it's the same, similar underlying technology of these large language models, a different type of task, and fundamentally, it does a different thing where they're generative and we are extractive.
Now, with ChatGPT, let's stay on this a couple of minutes longer because there's such great interest in it. Obviously, ChatGPT, you can have a conversation with, you can ask it to write you an essay, or if you're a student and you're lazy, you can ask it to do all sorts of things, right?
It's amazing with that.
Yeah. Now, with consensus, it's much more specifically about listing literature that's relevant to your question, right? But at the same time, you can also get ChatGPT to do that as well, right? So if you just wanted to search for literature of a certain type, scientific literature, you could either use consensus, you could use ChatGPT. How would the results be different between the two?
Yeah, so that is, you can ask ChatGPT to do that, but that is not what it is particularly good at. It is really, really good at subjective generative tasks. So what I mean, your example is perfect. If you wanted to write you a paragraph for your blog, it is truly amazing at that. And if you think back to what I said about how these language models are trained, there's a reason why it's amazing at that. It's basically been shown, you can think of it as being shown the entire internet. What are there a lot of on the internet? There's a lot of blogs. It has really perfectly learned how to write a blog like a human. But now if you ask it to do this more precise task of saying, hey, show me a paper that has looked to address the research question, does zinc treat depression? It will very confident, if you say, provide me links, it will very confidently send you a few links. That is not what it is really good at. Those links sometimes are to just papers that have nothing to do with what you originally asked. In my experience, many times that is actually the case. It is not meant to be a retrieval engine. Again, it is meant to be a conversational chatbot. So while it can execute that task, that is not what it's designed to do. And in my experience, it's not particularly good at. But if you asked it to if you asked it to say, does zinc treat depression? Tell me why or why not. It will very confidently write you a nice paragraph about it. Whether it's right or wrong, I don't know. Many times it probably is right. But again, it's not going to be citing its sources. You don't know how it's generated in that context. But it will very confidently do it for you.
Okay, well let's talk a little bit about the AI component. Now, OpenAI that produced ChatGPT. I don't know much about the funding of OpenAI, but I know that Elon Musk has got a few dollars in his back pocket that he could throw at something like this.
Yeah, well, he's the one he founded it.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So they had a lot of funding, is my point. Now, also, I don't also know how. I mean, I need to learn more about ChatGPT, but somehow they managed to get access to a vast amount of internet data. Now, all of that, also training what is one of the biggest neural networks in the world, that must have taken a lot of computational power, a lot of time, a lot of effort, and a lot of money. Now, how do you as a startup compete with that kind of enterprise?
Yeah, so I think an important note for OpenAI and ChatGPT is, a lot of their secret sauce is through their partnership with Microsoft. So Microsoft has a massive stake in OpenAI, and that is how they get all of their computational power is through a deal with Microsoft. Because the big cloud providers like Amazon and Microsoft and Google are the ones where a startup like us has to pay to then get access to these GPUs, which are the engines that power the ability to train these large language models. So how a startup competes? Well, first off, the hardest and most compute heavy part of it is not done by us. That is what the OpenAIs of the world do, where they embed that knowledge. And that is required to show it billions and billions and billions and billions and billions of examples. That is the real compute heavy part of this. Whereas the fine tuning part, which is what a startup like us has to do, relatively is tiny. That is where you're teaching it to do a custom task. Now, depending on what that custom task does, there's a wide range of how many examples you need to show it in order to do it well. Out of the box, these OpenAI models are incredibly good at, like we said, generating you text and writing you like a blog or a piece of marketing copy. If you're to try to train it to do fine tune it to do something like that as a startup or another company, the amount of data you need to do it is actually very, very, very small. In our case, where we're teaching it how to go through literature, the amount of data is quite a bit more. And the other component of it is the data that's required to do that has to be labeled and created by experts themselves. You can't just hire a bunch of Joe Schmoes off the street to go mark up papers to then feed to a model to teach it how to read like a
Mhm.
scientist. That won't work. So we had to hire scientists to go through hundreds of thousands of papers where they mark up the papers. We feed those marked up papers to a model to then teach it to effectively go through a paper like a scientist. So to uh, address the initial question, so basically what I'm saying is,
Yeah.
the companies take these foundational models that companies like OpenAI and Google have built, and then they customize them to do their specific task. The hardest compute part of that is that the building of the foundational models that's handled by the big dogs who have infinite ability to run these GPUs. Now the way that the cool thing is, so far this may change. OpenAI is pretty content to be the deployment layer where they're building these foundational models and they charge a company like us for usage of them. And they actually charge you more if you fine tune them to do a custom task because they know that likely means that you're using it for a specific purpose. You'll need to use it a lot. So then they actually like 10x the cost of usage. But that's how they make money. They charge for usage of their foundational models that they've built. So right now, there's no startup, unless a startup's trying to build foundational models, that is actually really
Mhm.
competing with OpenAI. They're actually just using OpenAI for their benefit. And the same goes for the cloud businesses of Google and Amazon and Microsoft. While obviously Google has their search engine, so if you're using their foundational models to build your search engine, you're in theory competing with Google to some extent. They have this whole separate arm of their business, which is just cloud compute infrastructure, and that allows companies like us to access GPUs for a price. And it's similar to the OpenAI aspect, where basically we're just paying them for usage of these GPUs to then train our own models. So you're not necessarily in competition directly with those parts of the business, if that makes
Okay.
sense.
All right. Now, consensus is not strictly confined to clinical science, but it is predominantly involved with clinical science. So why is it? Why is that?
Yeah, so about half of our literature is medical related, and that maps to what all literature is. The estimation is that there's about a billion peer-reviewed studies in the world. Nobody knows the exact number, and I believe if you look at the distribution of topics, somewhere in the ballpark of 40-ish% are biomedical, medical related papers. It's the most heavily studied. Domain because it's obviously incredibly important. It has to deal with our health. It also is most conducive to running experiments, right? It is the classic way you set up an experiment is done in a medical context where you give some people a treatment and you give other people a placebo and you test the results. Like that is the most classically set up experiment. And that's because scientists for so long have been focused on studying medicine and things in the clinical practice. And then for us, so not only is the source material makes up about half of all of the source material that we have, it's also our number one use case. And it's cool because it's a use case that spans consumers and it expands to professionals. We have doctors using our product. We also have, moms using our product to look up research on child development or if their child is sick, or we have fitness bros using our product to look up if a certain supplement is BS or not, or if a certain exercise regimen is good for their
Mhm.
knees or good for recovery. So it kind of has this unique, clinical literature kind of has this unique quality of spanning a huge variety of professional use cases, but also has immense interest from general consumers. So it's really been a big focus of ours because of that.
Okay. Well, let's talk about the very tricky and probably impossible to get perfect subject of bias. Now, in America in particular, there's been a lot of focus on political bias coming out of search engines, not just search engines, social media like Twitter and Facebook as well. Now, when it comes to search engines, do you think it's possible to have a objective criteria that make your results unbiased or not? Is this something that you've thought about or developed approaches to?
Yeah, certainly. So I think there are definitely things you can do to have your results be as objective as possible. And there's a ton of safeguards you can put in. There's a ton of additional analysis you can do to help guide a user to objective information. But at the end of the day, as much as you can do, you still are beholden to the underlying source material. And that is where we've done probably our most thought, that while peer-reviewed research is amazing and it's the greatest source of insight-filled data that has ever been created, it is still riddled with bias. And one of our big work streams right now is trying to use AI to objectively analyze given papers that then we can
Mm.
show that analysis to users to have them understand what is likely to be rigorous information. So, we're not showing any advertisements, so we have no priorities other than getting you good information.
Yeah.
And our models are trained to try to find questions that have tried to find claims that have answered your question and nothing more. So we think we think we're pretty good in that regard. Where we need to continue to do a lot of work is in analyzing and guiding the user about the underlying source material. Because if you type in "do vaccines cause autism" into our search engine, you'll get 10 studies that say no, there's no link, but then there's 3 studies or 2 studies that say there is a link. And we know that a lot of those studies are pretty famously had fingers on the scale and are pretty famously flawed. And what we need to do is build the tools that in an objective way can tell a user why that's the case, and put little tags and indicators on those sets of results to say, hey, this was a poorly designed study with an N of 1 and has been funded by a source that gives the study a conflict of interest. Like, that is our goal, to add those types of indicators to the results, because no matter how many safeguards you put in place and no matter how much deeply you've thought about it, if your underlying source material has bias in it, your results are going to have bias in it.
Yeah.
So you need to, in our eyes, you need to do as much as possible to try to vet that in a way that's objective. You can't just do it based on what you believe to be true.
Okay, I mean, let's stay on this subject for a moment, because it's really interesting and it's very difficult for you to take a view on, perhaps, but maybe you have, and I'd be really interested to know. I mean, let's think about Einstein. When Einstein formulated the theory of general relativity, he didn't have a position in a university. He was a patent clerk, right?
Mm-hmm.
So the point is that sometimes these major breakthroughs in science can come from really unexpected corners, can come from mavericks, people outside the system.
Yeah.
So what would be really ideal, and this is something, by the way, which mavericks kind of complain about, the peer review system, that it tends to support people who hold establishment views, and it tends to minimize these genius mavericks who are kind of outside on the periphery of the system. Now, so what would be great is we had a search engine that said something like, okay, here are your kind of standard results, but you might want to take a look at this funky study that nobody's looking at, but it looks pretty good to me. You know what I mean? Is that a kind of impossible ambition for a search engine, or what do you think?
Absolutely not. And that's what, that's really what we'd love to get to over time, is where all of that objective analysis is done on the pure paper level. So right now we have some like proxy metrics that indicate quality of the journal it comes from and the reputation of the author and how many times it's been cited. And those are great. They do have signal in them, but they definitely have some of the problems that arise that you just said, where, just because it comes from a journal that has previously produced good information doesn't mean that this paper itself is going to be a well-designed study. And
Right.
it makes it more likely, but that doesn't mean that it is. And the real power is when you actually can just look at the individual paper and pull out objective things from that paper and say, how likely is this to be a quality study? How likely is this to reproduce? That is what we want to move toward. That is what we are working on right now, that hopefully would address that exact problem that you're talking about, where you could have 2 studies. One comes from a really respected giant journal from a well-known author, and the other comes from a nobody when compared. But we'd love to be able to say, but this paper actually is done with all these incredible rigor standards, and look how beautifully designed this study was. This actually paper is better, even though it's not, or likely to be better, even though it's not from a reputable journal. Very hard. We are working on it. And that is the ultimate goal, that most of these metrics and most of this analysis can be done just on the study level. And you don't have to use proxy metrics that, while helpful, have many flaws and do not inherently mean that something is better than something else.
Okay, great. So let's talk about the limitations. What kind of technical limitations or any kind of limitations you're currently addressing or tackling?
Yeah, I mean, what I just talked about is one. The quality indicators we have in our product are all proxy metrics
Yeah.
as of right now. That will change in the next few weeks. We're adding the type of the study design tag indicator to the product, hopefully in the next week or two. So that is one limitation, that the quality indicators are all proxy metrics. A really big limitation that we um, there's pros and, like most things in tech, that it's all trade-offs, and there's huge pros to doing it this way, but then there's some cons, and we're trying to figure out the right way to address this to some degree while staying true to the pros that you get from it. And that is, because our system is fully extractive, we are pretty beholden to the way that we are beholden to the way that a scientist writes their claims. And people don't always write them in the most interpretable way, and sometimes they're missing some context from other parts of the paper. And we're pretty beholden to that, sentence structure that we're extracting. And when it works well, it's amazing, because if they've written a fully complete claim where they say the results from our study absolutely indicate that zinc can help treat depression. Boom, we can extract that sentence. When you ask, does zinc treat depression, we can match that to your question. And it is this beautiful, wonderful experience where we can't
Mhm.
make things up. We are showing you a word for word quote. We just answered your question. That's all well and good. But sometimes they might say, these results show that it helps, right? You need to learn about what they're talking about if we were to extract that sentence to actually give you some value. But that's a current limitation. We extract word for word sentences, so sometimes we're missing context. There's probably claims out there that we haven't extracted because we didn't think that it was a claim, when really, if you piece together parts of the paper, it actually would perfectly answer the question. But you have to balance that with, if you're going to do some generative work where, like, we tell a model to read through the paper and piece together multiple parts to it and then generate you a sentence that then we could surface to you, we can do that. But the problem is, some very non-0% of the time will be totally wrong, and the model will hallucinate, and the model will put together wrong pieces of it, and end up telling you something that is the exact opposite of what the scientist is actually saying, and could be harmful information. And that's that it could help a lot of cases, and we would do it right way more than we do it wrong. But there's huge asymmetric risk of when you're doing it wrong. So
Yeah.
we want to be really careful, and we do want to use some of this generative tech to help introduce some additional flexibility into our system. But we
Mhm.
really want to do it with guardrails, and we really want to be transparent with it, so that we don't run into that case where we're completely making something up out of thin air, and misguiding the user. So uh,
Sure.
so basically, the limitation is we're pretty beholden to the exact sentence structure. There are pros to
Right.
it, but we want to try to figure out a way to introduce a little more flexibility, but in the right way.
So now let's just imagine a nightmare scenario, and let's say that consent. I'm sure this won't happen, by the way, Eric. I'm sure it's a brilliant product. Let's say that people are listening to this podcast and they thought, "Oh, the consensus sounds amazing," and everyone started using it. Nobody's using Google Scholar anymore, but then it's discovered that actually there's something terribly wrong. Now, my question really is: there must be the consequences of that kind of nightmare are pretty profound. I mean, you could really disrupt all sorts of clinical science programs because people are looking at the wrong literature. It could have far-reaching consequences. So there must be some kind of regulatory or legal framework that you work within. Could you just describe that?
Yeah. So the it kind of actually ties back to that last statement I made, that because we're extracting word for word sentences, it really is no different than Google Scholar in terms of liabilities. We're not creating any of the content ourselves. So we effectively are just a much more advanced version of Google Scholar, which means that we don't really hold any liability for uh, the information that is sent back to you. No liability is the wrong way to put it, but it the same reason why, if you typed in a question to Google Scholar and you combed through literature and found something that was controversial, like, that isn't Google Scholar's fault. Like, there's just bad literature out there. And it's the same way for us, where
Mhm.
if we surface you a claim made that is controversial or wrong, that isn't really a consensus problem. That's a problem with the literature itself, and all we're doing is surfacing you results to your question. Now that can change if you're creating some of the content yourself. Now I don't know if I think there's some gray areas with the generative AI content, because it's not Eric Olson writing the content in a way that could be misleading. It's an
Mhm.
algorithm. And I think there is like a big gray area there, but like that is where you'd start to deal with much more liability. If you yourself are generating the content and then it turns out to
Mhm.
be misleading or wrong or harmful, you bear that liability for it. Whereas if it just is the underlying content that is in your search engine, because there's literature out there that is potentially harmful and controversial, that isn't on, you don't bear that responsibility as the search engine that's surfacing it, if that makes sense.
Okay. All right. Last question, Eric. And this has got nothing to do with search engines or consensus, and that is, what is your favorite example of medical AI currently used, nothing to do with your own?
Yeah. So it's a pretty classic example, but what I think is really cool about it is, so our partners that we work with that help us label these papers, how they got started was with this use case, which is using AI to read X-rays and detect abnormalities, things like tumors within X-rays. And they got started by they have a platform where doctors can go on and they label x-rays, that then they can take that data and train a machine how to read an x-ray like a human would and detect if there's something wrong with them. And I think this is really cool because not only does it clearly have real world benefits and potentially can save lives, I think it so clearly fits the qualities of a task that is well suited to be automated by AI, because it's manual, it's repeatable, and it follows a certain set of rules to make those detections. Right, like if if a doctor's doing it, they're likely doing a lot of these things subconsciously, but in your mind, you're basically going through a set of heuristics as you're reading an X-ray to determine if there's something wrong with it. And if something has that quality where a person is doing it and they're going through a set of heuristics and rules in their head to making it to come to a determination, that task can likely be way better done with AI. And I think that this is a counter, you wouldn't necessarily think of this as one that has those qualities, but if you really boil it down to the core competency of the task, it actually perfectly fits it. So I think it's a really,
Yeah.
really cool task that can save a lot of lives and is really well suited to be automated with AI.
Okay, that's a great answer. Look, I'm going to tag on one more question, if you don't
Yeah,
mind,
no worries.
and that is, because I think ChatGPT is so fresh, right? It's only 6 weeks old or something, but it's made such a big impact.
Yeah.
This strikes me as being a very, very rapidly evolving field. Is that true? How do you see this evolving in maybe the next 5 years or so?
Yeah, I think that's an understatement. It is AI is the fastest growing field in the world, and specifically the fastest growing part of AI right now is with this language model technology. So how do I see it evolving? I think I think ChatGPT is a little bit um, misleading is the wrong word, but it might give a little bit of a sense of the abilities of these models that isn't quite realistic, because it's basically designed to look and feel cool and like to delight and to wow the user. But these its ability to do, it's incredibly good at a certain set of tasks, specifically creative subjective tasks. And I think it's really interesting one that
Mhm.
uh if you had asked anybody about predictions about AI 5 years ago, the thing that everybody would say is, "Oh, the last place that's going to come and automate away jobs are in these creative, subjective
Right.
fields." Turned out to be completely wrong, which is really interesting. But anyway, it's amazing at those tasks, but I think it is still a little bit further away from being able to do real precise tasks at scale than people realize. Because I think it kind of the field in general, it's like a giant 80-20 problem where the first 80% is actually easier than people realize it is. And the last 20% of really getting out that true precision where it can be used at
Mhm.
scale and enterprises might be a little further away than people realize. But with that said, that is definitely coming. So I think
Yeah.
what we'll see is in the next year or two, we're going to see an explosion of use cases that have to do with these creative, subjective, generative tasks. It's so good at them now. We're going to see these cool user interfaces and slight tweaks to it where it does these, like, generates you articles and blogs and marketing copy, just in an incredible, magical way. And then it'll be a little bit further down the line where we'll start to see it pop up now, but it will be companies that have really put in a lot of legwork to customize their models to do specific tasks. And it'll be a little bit further down the line, a few years, where we start to see it do these more precise tasks that require more customization. I think that might be a little further away than people realize, but it's definitely coming. And never underestimate, GPT-4 is ChatGPT is built with GPT 3.5. GPT-4 is coming out in March. And everything I could say could be rendered obsolete then if, it might be able to actually solve all of our problems.
It's the singularity, man.
We'll see. Again,
Okay.
Always remember that ChatGPT is specifically designed to talk to you like a human and to wow and delight, which, it means it's not quite as magical as some people might believe.
Eric, I have immensely enjoyed our conversation. Thank you so much, and good luck with the consensus. I'm sure it's going to be a success.
Thank you so much. Thank you for having me. This is great.
Thank you for listening. I'm Felix Beacher. Ping me on LinkedIn for more information on Omdia's services in healthcare technology. See you next time.